Welcome to the novel In Search of Desultory Vivacity. Chapter 1, The Pleasure of the Moment. Andrew had only just awakened from a remarkably vivid dream where some disgruntled Buddhists were trying to poison the Pope in the middle of some multinational ecumenical conference held, in all places, Shanghai. The Pope had just delivered a speech wherein he tried to suggest that reincarnation was an elaborate illusion perpetuated by dark forces whose ultimate aim was to keep naive and sincere souls from embracing the love and mercy of Jesus Christ, by trapping them in the maze of many lives where details multiplied endlessly like some soap opera spinning out for decades. The Buddhists, of course, tried to set it up so that the Chinese would be pinned as the source of the machinations and eventually be embarrassed into releasing their stranglehold on Tibet in order to curry international favor. There was also some hint, some inner knowing, the kind that only comes in dreams, minus any supporting architectural details, that the Buddhists were actually Jesuits re-robed, having been trained in spiritual espionage since childhood in some well-disguised seminary secreted in some beautifully unassuming alpine valley. Showering, he dismissed any notion that it might be some well-placed psychic hint to ready him for upcoming action. Too weird even for him. An hour later, croissant and latte to the left of his Globe and Mail, he consumed the laundry list in Edward Snowden's latest dispatch from the belly of the unacknowledged beast. From what he could tell, the NSA, or some entity doing a very good impersonation, had been monitoring all communications from many embassies around the world for years, for decades. He also read that CSIS owned and operated every snooping device available to the NSA. Perhaps they also knew how to use them. Let's face it, switching stuff on could often be a challenge. He imagined staff bringing in their 9-year-olds to sort it out on one of those take-your-kid-to-work days. Hey, Dad, it's easy. Just do this, and then this, and then this. And look! There's that Brazilian mining company you were talking about. Look, parking lot on one camera, cafeteria on another, and boardroom on another. Geez, that must be some satellite. These days it was easy to lose your model outrage. Andrew had certainly misplaced his. Maybe it was buried in the garden, along with those 2 handguns wrapped in dish towels. Thank God he'd remembered to do that. They'd been under the kitchen sink, like some black and white British drama from the 60s, for months. Hetty, volunteering to do the dishes one night on her last visit, had very nearly found them. Then there was the update on drone kills, way more than he suspected, hundreds more. If it was sloppy planning or suspect intelligence, and he figured a bit of both, the collateral damage was far from contained. It reminded him of the Aussie band from when, the 90s? Weddings, parties, anything? That was about the measure of it. Shred the suckers, he heard someone saying. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name and all that? Some dastardly Republican senators had apparently built an electronic fence around Obama during a bowling tournament so that his balls would get stuck halfway down the lane, never reaching the much-desired pins. The reporter added that they had done so with a full measure of devilish glee despite their oft-professed Christian faith. The NSA had been unable, for some reason, to track and interrupt their planning sessions, and the FBI defended their lack of action on the basis of faulty intel, which had led them, somewhat embarrassingly, to an abandoned warehouse in Portland, Oregon, where they discovered some high school dropouts who, fancying themselves as world-class hackers, were busy burrowing into the nuclear networks of some foreign power. Andrew had the sneaky suspicion that the power not mentioned was Pakistan. Another disturbing story after that This one concerning lonely widows defrauded out of their life savings by unscrupulous Romeos with unpronounceable names, finished him for the morning, and he was glad to turn to one of his cafe habitués and continue their previous week's discussion about Camus and colonialism. She hailed from Trinidad herself, and thankfully did not seem to have any of the usual island attitudes about white people and privilege, which had pleased Andrew on their first encounter, as he had long tired of being forced into the apologist for the empire stance. Never again the saint of circumstance, he told himself. Not until the next time, anyway. Then Vivian's husband Eric appeared, and they veered into British military history, something that native of Nottingham was keen on. Andrew attempted to nudge him into one of the overarching narratives of spycraft, the study of which had recently become something of a fascination for him. Aside from the predictable balancing of action with contemplation, he felt like slotting himself into some kind of tradition, maybe to see which archetype he was inhabiting. Certainly not the traitor, or the obsequious courtier. Certainly not the seductive honeypot, although when he mentioned this train of thought later to Janet, she demurred, insisting that he was much more the honeypot than he realized. This was mid-afternoon email, answered by her coffee break text. They seemed to be going through one of those let's be sensible about this phases, keeping as clear from frenzied couplings as their languorous libidos would allow. And as V was acting out all the neurotic but supposedly lovable patterns of the expectant mom, despite an attentive husband subbing in for the father, the interregnum gave him some breathing space to cope with her march of mini-crises. To give due, though, Dennis was quite the regular in his "thanks so much, old man" emails, and they did feel quite sincere. God only knows what he had to put up with. And if paternity helped seal a lifetime of distrust and enmity between him and Alex and send the old man off to heaven with a smile on his face, then surely it was a small price to pay. And if the soul of the babe did turn out to be Lara reborn to her two best friends, then, oh well, he'd deal with that later. Babies were babies regardless of soul tenure. He could act like a loving friend before acting like a loving father. Sure he could. Everything was an act anyway. That was one thing he'd learned from being buddy bus driver prior to Mr. Millionaire. People saw that expectations, not him. Expectations derived from social standing and economic role. Andrew was the guy hiding inside the image, inside looking out, and not always liking what he saw. But then, who did? Janet said she did, at least seeing the real Andrew inside the role play, and she insisted that she was sufficiently anxiety-free to say that with confidence. The court case was months away and the police had stopped bugging her. With no DNA match, they'd pretty much backed off. Jackson was out on bail and staying at the girlfriend's. Her life unfolded from day to day without much stress, and yahoo, she still had Andrew, despite the complications of his life. Another text arrived as he looked through the Guardian online. Her trip out west to see her parents had been set. And surprise, surprise, she was actually looking forward to going. An hour later, it was maybe just for the escape value. An hour after that, it was, am I just running from myself? He replied, feeling wise beyond his years. Wherever you go, there you are. And speaking of going places, where did Hugh and Robert wind up? Dennis swore he hadn't been let in on the secret, that higher-ups with a need to know, or maybe with a need not to know, had planned a route and funded the travel, likely with untraceable cash. It could be anywhere from Santiago to Melbourne, any big city where they could blend in seamlessly, anywhere the Mossad or its affiliates couldn't find them. Dennis had said not to fret about it farther, that it was out of their hands for good, that they'd done their bit for freedom of speech and speaking truth to power, and all that good stuff that the occupiers prattled on about. Andrew considered himself to be lucky to be satisfied with this barrage-like response. The world was full of folk who'd find it bereft of the reassuring sustenance that helps them sleep at night. But he was not one of them. He could slither into the arms of sleep without much ado, and never could get why the much ado about nothing crowd couldn't. Even at the height of his student struggles, where grades and girlfriends vied to encase him in concrete and wealth had yet to insulate him, slumber could always be relied on to show up when required with the opiates of blessed unconsciousness. Fretting about the cunning fabrications nibbling away at the cheery semblance of democracy that the West held so dear was reserved for the daytime hours. After midnight, as Eric Clapton so astutely observed, we're going to let it all hang out. And for Andrew that meant hang out to dry, and all that implied. Of course, these days blessed unconsciousness was often interrupted by flights of OBE fancy, rendering him ever so agile in his immobility. The two Andrews, he'd sometimes say to Janet, who would respond with a reassuring embrace of some kind and a declaration of undenying affection for the one right here. And although he felt a genuine gratefulness oozing in her general direction, he could also not dissuade himself from the disconcerting notion that two was actually better than one. It was enough to make you queasy with psychic discomfort, Janet heard. She offered his shoulder for his weary head. At least she did the last time he mentioned it. He wondered if he'd have the courage to mention it again. Oh, sure he would. She didn't think he was nuts. In fact, she liked the psychic bit. It always intrigued her. And why should he care anyway? She had hots for him something fierce, not to mention the pile, the garden, and the overlapping lake. What, me? Worry? Enough fraternizing with his tepid insecurities. It never did him any good anyway. Using yourself as a punching bag only gained the bruises you were trying to avoid from other sources. Walking to the Lakeshore Park always worked, and today was no exception. The heat wave had passed, leaving Rowanton refreshed from thundery rain and a day that might reach 25°C. He sat in the shade of his favourite willow and watched whatever passed through his gaze: strollers, dogs, seagulls, sparkles of sunlight, mating dragonflies, with a splash of surf as the soundtrack. How pleasant was the passing moment when you released the caged birds of neurotic obsession to fly to the sun and melt their wings. The minutes multiplied magically. Praying for them not to end usually signaled their imminent demise. And sure enough, his dog-walking friend Gail, with her golden pal Winston, appeared at his side with a neighbourly smile. They shared their seemingly natural compatibility, had they as done since meeting at almost this spot ages ago, without ever feeling the need to spin it into any kind of casual sensuality. Gail had always seemed like a very fulfilled and fantasy-free career woman, and Andrew was always relieved to spend a few moments in her company. If she had any designs on him, he had yet to sniff them out. Her marketing position often involved travel, and although not always to exotic locations, she always seemed to enjoy the airborne release from office rituals. And Andrew found her voice and manner so appealing he was content to hear of whatever adventures, provocative, hilarious, or petty, that she might care to relate. In her turn, Gail found Andrew so unassuming, so seemingly carefree, that she was fascinated to see if he ever became overwrought about anything. There had been times in their see you when I see you interaction when she felt his relaxed mode to be closer to sleep than anything. And his pace when strolling, for it could be called nothing else, was agonizingly slow, fit only for the fellowship of achy seniors. Certainly not Gail and Winston, who liked to break into a trot when the mood took them. Their converse on this occasion was as enjoyably silly and superficial as they both preferred, laughing at the little tricks life liked to play. That, if nothing else, helped redress the balance. Having achieved their unstated aim, Gail and Winston set off on their rounds, leaving Andrew to once more contemplate the passing moment with all its anarchic ingredients. Later, on one of those near-perfect summer days when time seems not only suspended, but dismissed from its onerous duties, he found himself seated on one of his Muskoka chairs, examining his vegetable garden. The various spring fruits, such as asparagus, long gone, he looked at his cherry tomato bushes and diminutive raspberry shoots. Not bad for a first year, he had been told by one who should know. Just wait until next summer. It was beginning to look like one of those luxuriously empty days when small pleasures of life took over, quite effortlessly, from the pressing schedules and pleasing others. And one could carefully examine the antics of insects, hundreds of whom honoured the dictates of traditional behaviours, inches from one's feet. Andrew knew that his pastime could easily extend like ground-penetrating radar into the soil, but gooey worms were a bridge too far, and after a while he threw his head back to enjoy the still cool breeze from the lake, as it contradicted most appealingly the insistent opinions of the sun. Eyes closed, the parade of memories passed by, verging on incoherence. An irritable V vexing him with complaints, an amorous Janet complaining of being ignored, an excitable Hetty describing her son's increasing interest in Polly, and the distinct possibility that he might step up to the plate and ask for her hand in marriage, finally ensuring that the family line would be continued without any Catholic interference. Those three seemed to be the most insistent. Underneath them, others rumbled quietly. Dennis wondering if he really could still his international wanderlust long enough to be an attentive father. Bridget complaining that her boyfriend, quite manageable until recently, had suddenly decided that he needed an occasional trip on his own, and swearing that he did not have a mistress in Rio. And beneath those, the vague and patchily incoherent interactions of hypnagogia, as ephemeral as smoke, but very entertaining. How pleasant was the passing moment if one could but attend to it, and not a smidgen of boredom looming in on any horizon. And for once he did not guiltily attribute any of this to his wealth-induced leisure. It was just there, hovering, mirage-like, until you focused into reality. Now, surely that was a step forward. The Presbyterian Buddhist had stopped jousting with himself. Or was he merely resting between tosses of the hanky? Well, shoot, now he was thinking it over, tossing his pleasure into the moment to the winds, while he worried yet another bone of discontent. Maybe it was time for tea, or lunch, or something. Chapter 2, not too shabby. That very evening of the day when nothing very much occurred and supper had been less than inspiring, a leftover pasta concoction that had looked on paper the night before, it looked good, but had failed to prove itself on the palate. Well, Janet saved the day, although it was evening, with one of her Skype serenades. She was, he could tell, just in the mood for one, and after a brief "how are you and what's happening," she launched into a reading of a novel she was enjoying. It was witty, sardonic, and shape-shiftingly mystical, its characters morphing into inverted versions of themselves at the drop of the author's whim. It reminded Andrew, as he rested in the flow of Janet's dulcet tones, trained by years of reading stories to children, of Jeff Dyer, that wondrous anarchist of the English sentence. It wasn't, as he later discovered, but there was an endorsement by Dyer on the back cover, praising Derwent's twisted magic realism. Derwent Burwash? That's quite a tag. Yes, I thought it sounded hokey somehow. Maybe he's hiding his passion from his parents. While living a life of quiet desperation as an accountant, in the suburbs of a brutally large city, and not travelling between Cornwall and Provence as the bio claims? Yeah, sounds way more diminutively Kafkaesque to me. Probably bullied mercilessly by some Amazon warrior at work.